Good morning and welcome to another Thought for the Week here at MSBC. I wanted to reflect with you this morning on a couple of bills that were passed in Parliament last week. One surrounding the debate around abortion and the law around abortion, but also one, the bill on assisted dying towards the end of the week. And I know that a number of you have been talking about these issues and reflecting on them and wondering, what our response as Christians should be. Now, I don't want to wade into the specifics of the bill. If you wanted to look at those, they're available on the parliamentary website. They're available, I think, on the news bulletins in various different outlets that covered the bills and their passage through Parliament. And it's worth saying that both of those bills are still journeying through Parliament and need to go through the House of Lords and so on, and their full process before they can be deemed to law. But it raises questions, I think, and it's raised questions for a number of you around how do we assign value and worth to life? So I don't know if you've heard people use this phrase. It's a phrase that I think is not a nice phrase at all. But you heard someone say of another person, that person's a waste of space. Maybe you've used that phrase of another person. And what it is, and I think what's troubling about it for me is that, we often therefore are implying or assigning a lower worth and a lower value to that person and their life based on kind of our assessment of often the choices that a person has made or the state that a person finds themselves in socially, economically, those kind of places. And we assign a lesser value to that person than perhaps what the societal kind of average is or what our view of what a good livable life is. Who gets to determine what the value of life is? Who gets to decide the worth and the significance of life? And I think for me, these two bills, they raise those kind of questions. They raise the questions of what is the value of life and who determines what the value of that life is. And we can kind of get into these two tribal groups, can't we, where we have very fixed ideas in one side or another, and I think there's a lot more kind of nuance, and I think there's a lot of pastoral implications around a lot of these issues. And this idea that one group is utterly virtuous, the other group is utterly monstrous, is unhelpful. And there are deep, painful, real issues surrounding both of those debates that it's worth bearing in mind as we have the conversation. So as I say, I don't want to go into the specifics of the bills, but to talk about that wider subject about the value of life. So for me, I believe when it comes to birth and to the creation of life, that life begins at conception. It's not when you have the fertilization of an egg and you have the embryo beginning to form, the baby beginning to form. I don't believe that it's a potential life. I believe that it is a life with potential, a life with the potential to grow and to carry on through its development, to be born and then to live a human life. When you look at the kind of statistics and the phases of human development, you see around 3 weeks after conception, there is a heartbeat that is detected. 3 weeks. Around 6 weeks, brain activity is detected. At around kind of 8 weeks, a baby can suck its thumb, respond to touch, make facial expressions in the womb. There's spontaneous movement that is there. And all of this before 12 weeks. Now, the legal limit at the moment for the termination of a pregnancy for an abortion is, I think, 24 weeks. And so, you're talking about all of those things have happened halfway before you get to the point where legally that's allowed to happen. who is it that assigns the value and worth to that life? That life that is continuing on. I believe it's a continuation of life, not a transition into life. So it's not that there's not a life and it transitions into suddenly being a life. It is always a life that is continuing to develop and to grow. But who assigns the value and the worth of that life? Is it a judicial panel? Is it a group of MPs in Parliament? Is it the mother? Is it a doctor? Is it a family member? Is it society? Or do we believe that there is a worth and a value that is given to life, even at its most vulnerable and early stage, that surpasses all of those things, that inherently is given by God? You know, the psalmist says, "You knit me together in my mother's womb. You know, your eyes saw my unformed body. I am fearfully and wonderfully made." That's what the psalmist says in Psalm 139. Now, as I say, we don't want to, and I certainly don't want to, come into this view of saying, well, this one group that believes that is utterly virtuous, and anyone who doesn't believe that is utterly monstrous. I don't believe that at all. And there are painfully hard decisions around this subject, but it's worth reflecting that as a society, do we place a lesser value on life under those circumstances? There was someone in the news who said recently, I think it was a doctor, that she was told, I think around the end of her first trimester, that her baby would be severely disabled. And the nurse said to her, "I'm so sorry." And then in the next breath said, "I can book you in for a termination next week." Now, because that child would be heavily disabled, because that child potentially was viewed by that person as a burden upon the parents, the family that they'd be born into, because they might be viewed as a burden on society or by society, was there a lesser value attached to that baby's life than to another child that would be born without those disabilities? And so these are the questions, as I say, that we need to reflect upon about the value and the worth of life, and who determines the value and the worth of life. When we come to the assisted dying bill, for example, you know, what about the value of life even up to the end of life? And again, I understand the arguments around people with severe and debilitating and disfiguring terminal illnesses, and the need to ease their suffering. We talked, you know, some of us already today about how, you know, we care for animals, and this is one of the debates that I've heard used in this whole discussion, is that, you know, if an animal was sick, if your beloved pet was sick and in pain and dying, you would want it to be not suffering anymore. And why can't we do that with human beings? Well, the difference is that as much as we love our animals, as much as we love our pets, the value and the worth of human life is far greater than the value of and worth of animal life. And, you know, before anyone starts to think that I'm not loving of animals, then, you know, my cat and my dog would beg to disagree. You know, I love them dearly. They are part of the family, but their value and their worth is less than that of my son or my wife or any member of humanity. So, you know, how do we again place the value on life, even when people are in that terrible, painful position and situation? You know, I worked for a year in a hospice in London whilst I was training for ministry as a chaplain, and I have been with, both in that time and in pastoral ministry for almost 20 years since, with many people who have been towards the end of their life. Some of you watching this, I will have sat with you, with your loved ones, as they've been dying. When I was in the hospice in London, I had patients who asked me to help them to end their lives. And that was a terrible thing to experience, and but immeasurably less terrible than what it must have been like for that person to go through that. And it felt awful because there was a little bit of me that wanted to. And that is, I think, a reflection of our love and our humanity, that we understand the nuances around these issues. However, again, it comes back to, for me, this question of where do we place the value of life, and who gets to decide on the value of that life? And when it comes to the ending of that life, who gets to decide it? Is it a doctor? I mean, God forbid it should be a room full of politicians. Is it a judge, a panel, the family, the individual themselves? These are all questions that come up again. Or is it that there is a value and a worth of that life, even in suffering, even in pain, a dignity which cannot be taken away by sickness, that cannot be diminished by suffering and pain, that everyone has, because everyone is given that dignity, that value, that worth by God, that God created us in his image, that we see Jesus who, is, who goes through suffering, terrible suffering, immeasurable suffering, and yet still has the worth and the value of someone who is fully human, even in that moment of great darkness and great trouble and great pain. And again, we look at the conflict around the world. We look at what's happening in Gaza at the moment, and how there is a diminishing of the value of life, where it's easier to bomb someone if you have diminished their value and their worth. We saw this in the concentration camps of Europe in the 1940s, where it's easy to herd people into gas chambers because you've diminished their value. It's not really a person or a full human being that you're getting rid of. It's somebody lesser, someone of lesser value. Now, we may not see people being herded into concentration camps like they were 80 years ago, 85 years ago. But we do see in our society the diminishing of life, the diminishing of the value and the worth of individuals based upon how our society views that worth and who the people are that are making those decisions. And I think we need to, as we enter into these discussions and debates as Christians, we need to be aware, first and foremost, of the worth and the dignity that is given to each and every human being by their Creator. It cannot be taken away based on the whims of Parliament. It cannot be taken away based on the conflicts that are happening around the world. It cannot be taken away by the best interests of the family or the people around that particular person. It is inherently given. If a person doesn't match up to the social economic standards of society, their value is no less in the eyes of God. Someone who others would deem to be a waste of space is treasured and precious and beloved to the God who created them in his image. And so we need to be aware of that as we come into those conversations. We need to do so as well with great sensitivity. Not coming in like a bull in a china shop or kind of rushing in with our pre-prepared theological sledgehammers to come in and land the blows that we want to land. We need to come with that sensitivity to understand that for people in these conversations, often they are deep, troubling, painful, heart-wrenching situations. And we need to enter into those discussions willing to listen and willing to love people and to journey with them in that conversation. And I don't think we always do that very well. It's a difficult thing to do, to put aside for a moment our own desire to be right and to hear another person. Whether that changes our view or not, that doesn't come into it, but to hear another person, that they might feel valued and heard, whether or not we agree with them, is important as well. So I just wanted to share some of those thoughts with you this morning, but they're by no means exhaustive, and there's so much more I could say, but I'm not going to today. But as you reflect upon those bills that have been passed, and as you try to work out, in your own faith, as you read the Bible, as you believe what you believe about God and about humanity, may you see first and foremost the undeniable worth and value of each and every human being and the dignity of each and every human being. And may you be a voice for those who cannot speak for themselves. And lastly, I'd encourage you to pray. Just pray for the many, many people who will be affected right across the spectrum by these bills that are going through Parliament at the moment, and for the people for whom this discussion and debate in Parliament raises difficult and painful memories and conversations and decisions for the future as well. And as you do that, and as some of you may have wrestled with some of those things, may God bless you today.